So I thought that's cool, that's the traumatic part of the book over. Nope, there's more! Change it. I want a different outcome. I don't want this to be how it is. It is an experience. Often referred to as the best self-published fantasy book of all time, we have Sword of Kaigen. Now, you will not last very long in the self-published fantasy space without hearing the title Sword of Kaigen. It ranked number 1 on the r/fantasy subreddit for self-published fantasy books for the last million years, it looks like. This book is so highly praised and I cannot wait to read it. This is going to be a deep dive into the Sword of Kaigen, which means this will be a spoiler-filled video, so if you haven't read it, you might want to go away, read it, and then come back. But I'm excited for this. Okay, I am about 15% into Sword of Kaigen, and I just want to start with, how cool is a setting where it's a school on top of a mountain that shakes with the wind, so the whole building seems to sway? That's just such a cool setting. I love it. It's such a cool place to start the book at. So the book opens following Mamoru, who is a young boy who is going to this school, and he's part of this Matsuda family, which is this very famous family and very well-renowned family. And he's kind of trying to live up to this idea of what he should be as a Matsuda. They're known for this very famous sword trick called the Whispering Blade that leans into this magic system of, it's almost elemental. So far we've just kind of seen water and ice. The Whispering Blade is when you create a sword made of ice that's hard enough to kill. And the other point of view is Misaki, who is Mamoru's mother, and it seems to really be focused in on this Matsuda family. And it's got really nice like family dynamics. Well, not so nice is a strong word. It's got interesting family dynamics. And one thing I knew about but I forgot was this is like an urban fantasy. It is pretty much modern day. They talk about smartphones, which is bizarre to see because this island is very traditional. They all use swords. They all go to school wearing these very traditional uniforms, and they're just a very traditional people on this Sword of Kaigen island. So it's a stark contrast when this new transfer student comes in called Kwong, who is from another island, and he's kind of showing Mamoru that life on the island isn't the only way to live. In fact, not only that, but what he has heard on the island might not be 100% true. So because this is a very traditional, sort of isolated island, they are told that they are the protectors of the Kaigenese Empire, which is this larger empire that they are kind of on the front of because they're an island. And on the island, they believe that they're heralded as these mighty warriors that protect the entire country from all these invaders in past. However, Kwong is hinting at the fact that that might not be true and this might be more of a propaganda, but because it is so traditional, Mamoru is finding it really difficult to comprehend that this, what he believes, isn't necessarily the truth. However, I will say that this book drops a lot of world building and lore on you very quickly. There is a classroom chapter, and I was listening to it on audiobook. I'm kind of jumping between the physical and the audiobook. And it was this lesson, history lesson, and the teacher was going over these different countries and this sort of political machinations and the history of who was battling who in the past. And I was sitting there doing something else while I was listening to it, and I'm going to have to rewind this. I have no idea what's going on. It's a lot of information just dumped on you. And it makes sense in a school setting, but this definitely just was a way to get this information and lore across, and it felt like that. It felt like a lot of information to digest at once. And this is on top of the already quite difficult to wrap your head around world building, because there is so many unique terms. They have lots of different words, in-world words, that are just used, and I'm fine with that with fantasy, especially epic fantasy. You just trust that the author is going to let you know when you need to know what these are, and you're not required to necessarily keep track of everything all the time. However, that history lesson, that was a lot. I hope I don't need to remember that because it's already kind of gone. The other thing that kind of caught me off guard was the usage of the Japanese language. This is very heavily inspired by Japanese culture, as you can see by the hiragana and the kanji on the naked hardback. But inside, it uses Japanese words right at the start. Yoroshiku onegaishimasu, which is the Japanese term. This kind of a greeting, but if you translate it directly, it kind of translates to something like, be kind to me. But it is used as a greeting. And the other word was genkan, which is the sort of this little step before you go into a house. You take off your shoes in the genkan before you go inside, because in Japanese culture, you don't wear shoes indoors a lot of places. But this isn't an alternate history book. This isn't Japan. There's no reference to Japanese, but obviously Kaigenese leans very heavily into that as an influence. I think even the map looks a bit like Japan. But when you're making up so many other words and changing it, it just feels weird to chuck in a couple of real Japanese words in between all this made-up language. It just completely surprised me. I was like, what? This is really weird. It was a little bit of a strange choice. But overall, I am really enjoying this so far. I cannot wait to get further into this and see where we're going. Okay, Misaki is a badass. She's such a cool character. At the start, we get hinted a lot about her backstory, and finally, we've had a flashback chapter, and we get to see what it was like with her life before getting married to Takaru and having kids. And she was pretty much Batman. Okay? She was friends with a guy called Robin, and they were vigilantes, and she was called the Shadow. Misaki is Batman, okay? But I really enjoyed learning more about her past. I really like the way that the author has used the magic system to sort of contrast these 2 points in her life. Robin is a fire-wielding magic user, whereas Takaru is this ice and water, basically Bender from Avatar. And what's really cool is it relates really heavily to their personalities, and those are obviously stark contrasts to her the two parts of her life. So Robin's very bold and bright, whereas Takaru is very cold and standoffish. So sort of, I love when authors are able to use these fantastical elements to then add something to the plot or the characters or the themes. So having that contrast in the magic is very cool. I like that. And bloodbending, they have bloodbending in this. It's very similar to the Avatar magic system. That is not a complaint. I love it, and also it makes sense in the world. So just jumping straight into it. The start of this book sets up this world and this idea that the Empire is not completely truthful with the people of Kaigen. And then we get to see these storms that are hitting different parts of the country, but it's heavily implied that these are probably not storms. And then the Ranganese, which is this different region and people, start attacking the Sword of Kaigen. And this is kind of the middle of the story. And I did hear about this, that the sort of what most would consider the climax is sort of the middle part of the book. So it's really interesting to have these two come head to head in the middle of the book. But this middle section has been a whirlwind. Pun intended. I didn't actually mean that. And I'm not huge on extended battle sequences, but this part of the book has been riveting. It's been really hard to put down because it's done so well to have this really long battle. It takes up a huge portion of the book. I'm not even done with it yet. But it's so impressive that the author is able to keep this interesting and sit on the edge of your seat for as long as she is doing. It's really difficult to put down. You want to just keep reading and find out what's happening. And with extended battle sequences, it can get very repetitive. However, this author, M.L Wang, does an amazing job of not making it repetitive. each person is dealing with the battle in a different way. So we've got Mamoru, who's just getting into war and battle, and this is his first ever battle. And one of the things that this book does really well is it doesn't glorify war, which in some fantasy books it's not glorified, but it is seen as this really cool epic battle between two people, whereas this is a very realistic. There's magic, so it's not necessarily realistic, but it's more grounded in the fact that Mamoru is seeing the horrors of war, which is really interesting for someone who's been brought up and taught that they are this legendary people. They were born to defend their country, and it would be an honor to fight and die in war. But suddenly, when Mamoru is thrown into battle and he sees his teachers and his people he's growing up with that are incredibly strong warriors dying around him, and his reactions to that, it's quite heavy. This whole middle section there's so many cool bits, but some of it's really, really heavy too. And then we've got Misaki, who I did just finish saying that she's an absolute badass, but what I love that the author's done with her is that she's not just this invincible badass. She complains about having a sore back, and she complains about not being up to par with how she was when she was younger. And I do feel like that's an element sometimes that can be skimmed over, these older heroes that then haven't trained in 10-15 years. Is you're not going to be as limber, and she's trying to outsmart them because she knows she's not as agile as she was. I like when the author includes something like this, just to kind of ground the fact that, yeah, she is a badass, and she's an amazing warrior, but she's not trained in a long period of time. And the usage of the magic system, whew! There's so many creative uses of this elemental magic. Yes, it's mainly bending the elements and being able to do things with it, but how the author has then taken that and really delved deep into how people would use it in a battle application. This between Takeru and... oh, I'm terrible with names. What's the name of Takeru's brother, who's like the mayor? I can't remember, but those two teaming up and creating this ice dragon that's able to battle against these different warriors. And the fact that one is kind of keeping it held together, all this ice, and this other one's kind of controlling its movements. That's cool. That's so cool. It's such a cool use of the magic. So needless to say, I am having a really good time with this book. I'm also watching Blue Eye Samurai on Netflix, which is like the perfect pairing. The only thing is I just want to become like a samurai on a frozen mountaintop and just sort of... If I had read one more chapter, that update would have looked very, very different. Oh no. Where do you start with that? So Mamoru was killed, and it was heartbreaking. It was much ouchies, much in the feels, and I'm not a fan. Didn't like it. No. But the worst part, the absolute worst part, it wasn't just the fact that he died. It wasn't the fact that he died alone. It wasn't the fact that his father was the one who left him on the front lines, and then his uncle, the uncle's death was brutal too. The fact that everybody knew he was dead, but no one really saw him die. But the worst part of it all is the fact that Mamoru finally achieved the Whispering Blade, this bloodline trait that's passed through the generations that only a few Matsudas can actually master. And the whole book, even right at the start of it, Mamoru was worried about trying to live up to the Matsuda name and being able to pull off this trait that just shows that he is a Matsuda in a way. And the fact that he pulled it off, but he did it alone just before he died, and no one's going to know. No! That was the worst part. That's the part that really hit home for me, was the fact that he succeeded. But there is this idea that you don't need to be in the eye of other people to have succeeded. And that is a theme in the book, or an idea that's brought up of philosophy in the Matsuda people, that Misaki, I think, was the one that was talking to Mamoru about it. But it doesn't matter. I wanted Mamoru to get the accolade. He deserves it. He was so out of his depth. And he did so well. I feel so bad. Oh, no. No. So I thought, that's cool. That's the traumatic part of the book over. Nope. There's more. Following Misaki's response to that is brutal. The fact that she fought back against Takeru and told him that it's his fault that their son died. I need to put this into context. Okay, so the battle finishes, and this next section follows kind of the aftermath. It's everybody sort of grieving and dealing with the loss of the war, or the battle. And this whole section is really difficult to read. M.L Wang did an amazing job of showing grief and pain and the trauma of war in such a deep and meaningful way, but also a varying way. It's really interesting to see how different characters are reacting to this traumatic experience in very different ways. Setsuko is kind of she broke down for a bit, but then she was very much like pull herself together very quickly and help others, and she's kind of smiling through it and trying her best to keep together. Misaki's falling apart a lot more, and she's just a lot more withdrawn and blaming it on Takeru, who is just kind of aloof in a way with himself. And then there's the whole subplot line with Hiroshi, who was assaulted in the war by one of the soldiers, and having her deal with that and not telling anyone apart from Misaki who found her is so heavy. It's so traumatic and heavy. How this book is dealing with war and showing all the horrific things that can happen and how it affects people and how it affects people in different ways is so well done, but it's so incredibly difficult to read, particularly this section in the aftermath, where it just, there's times where I didn't want to pick it up because it just is such a downer and so to read. And then the soldiers come and you think, great, the Kaigenese soldiers are coming to help clean up and sort of build this village back up. But no, instead they take all the dead and then they put them in a pit and then they burn it and cover it. So there's no memorial or anything to show that this battle happened. That whole sequence with the pit of the dead warriors and people who died in the fighting, and then all the people in the village rebelling against that, but then Takeru kind of saying, no, this is the empire, we have to listen to them, and then him just disappearing as everybody's grieving and dealing with this horrific burning of all their dead in one pit that has to be unmarked, so no one gets to be able to remember this loss and this battle. It really painted Takeru as this very unlikable character and someone who is very set in their ways and very traditional, but there's no leeway. Even if they can see themselves that something is wrong, then there's still no leeway. They're just so set in their morals and what they think is right that they're going against their own morals. Then you think, okay, that's it. This is the traumatic book. This is it. It's just going to ease off and we're going to come to some nice conclusion. No, there's more. There's more drama. So then we get to find out why Takeru is the way he is in one of the most brutal chapters I have read, where we follow Takeru fighting Misaki, and you learn that Takeru is just as traumatized and hateful of what he's done and what he's doing and what's going on, but he has this escape in the magic system where he can actually become part of the mountain. He kind of sinks into the water and the ice, and he spreads his emotions and kind of disassociates just because he thinks he can't face the horrific things that are happening. So he finds this way to kind of step away from it all and disassociate. And we get a bit about how this happened when he was younger as well, with some of the things in his past that just was scarring to him. So it turns out he's a very troubled character as well. And again, going back to what I said at one of the earlier points, is using the magic system and the fantastical elements to kind of create this imagery and this idea of some of the mental struggles and turmoils of the character is such an interesting way of using fantasy to tie it into the themes and the ideas and the characters. And the way that that is done with Takeru was so interesting. I've not read a character that's completely flipped on his head in my opinions of them in such a short period of time. It was so interesting and heartbreaking and awful, and the way that Misaki and Takeru kind of come together, and the fact that they both were in this relationship and they didn't really want to step on each other's toes in a way. They didn't want to get too involved with each other because they thought the other one wasn't interested in them. And they spent so long pushing the other one away when they could have been a lot closer. And then there's all the problems with Mamoru dying, and she was blaming him for his death, but he knew that he was probably going to die. Oh, I just can't do it. I'm going to finish it, then we'll wrap up with the final thoughts. Okay, so I have finished the Sword of Kaigen, and now I completely understand why so many people say it is the best self-published fantasy book of all time. It is an experience. This book has a really weird and interesting structure. It's very non-typical in the fantasy space. Very often with fantasy books, the climax to the story is some sort of confrontation between two parties. It's where everything sort of comes together and they fight, and then the good guy normally wins, and that's fine. And then you get what's called the falling action, which is this last, usually pretty short section where you just have the main character reminiscing, and you're kind of seeing the fallout of that climax of the story. This is Frodo going home to the Shire and finding out it's not the same as when he left. However, with Sword of Kaigen, the falling action is a huge part of the story. It's probably about the last 35% of the story, and typically it's normally about 10%. So the structure feels very uneven for a fantasy reader, or very non-typical. It's not what you would expect. And I think that's a huge draw to the book, because it does make it this very interesting story with this long fallout, because it is more of a war epic story than your typical fantasy novel. It does feel like it's kind of obviously not a history book, but in that sense that it feels like a retelling of a real war that happened, and is more of a case study about war and kind of what it does to this very small village. And this has a ton of prose. This means that we're really delving deep into the fallout of the main conflict. We get to go really deep into the themes and the character psyche and the whole sequence with Misaki grieving and seeing the different variations in characters grieving for the horrific things that happened in the conflict, and also this revelation of Takeru as a character and seeing that he is just as troubled as everybody else worked so well. Brutal, beautiful, and traumatic. I personally loved it, but I did find myself finishing chapters and feeling like this is a perfect stopping point. I have no idea what we're going to do more from here, just in that last falling action section. But I did feel a couple times like, are we not done yet? The scope of this story is huge. We have different empires fighting against each other. We have this massive political machinations between countries, this propaganda, and all this very big, large-scale conflicts. And I did worry earlier on, how are we going to really delve into that deeply if we're just rooted in a couple of characters in the same family? However, M.L Wang did such a good job of having this large-scale story, but keeping it very grounded in her characters. And that really added an emotional impact, because it was how these large-scale conflicts are affecting everyday people, how they are affecting the people who are living in these countries. I did have some gripes with some aspects of the story feeling very open-ended at the end of the book. only to later find out that this was originally planned to be a series, and then the series was kind of cancelled and it was turned into a standalone. And after I learned this, the ending and sort of the cut off parts of the narrative made so much sense. I do feel like there were several parts of the story where it was setting up to continue on. It was setting up to be something in later books, particularly with Robin. His whole storyline, especially in the last couple chapters where he comes to visit the Matsudas and is about what he was doing in the years since he was last with Misaki, and leaning into this bigger conflict and the blood magic that's only hinted at. It felt very much like a setup. It felt like it was leaning into the rest of the story. And I do think if people read this, knowing it is a standalone, and coming to that, I can see some frustration in feeling like we're never going to get answers to that part of the plot. Even on a smaller scale, some of Mamoru's brothers that still survived, like the youngest one who ended up killing a soldier in the conflict despite being very young and just being very straight-faced and normal about it, it felt like that was setting up of a character. But it didn't come of anything towards the end of the story because it was just the end of the battle, the fallout, and then it was cut off. Again, this just feels like it was setting up for a story, and I want to know the answers. I want to know where this goes afterwards. It most certainly did not ruin the story for me. I loved this book so much. It was definitely a 5-star read for me personally. I loved it, and I do think that it's well worth reading, even with these elements that feel like they're not completely round off. There is definitely a complete story there. It's just, it hints at this future installment that we're not going to get, which is really sad. I really hope M.L Wang kind of changes her mind and does a sequel, some sort of follow-up, maybe from Robin's perspective. Would be really cool. And it hurt me so many times. There's so many moments I was like, no, change it. I want a different outcome. I don't want this to be how it is. It's brutal, but it's an amazing read. And thank you very much for watching. I don't know what to say. This book hurt. What did you think of Sword of Kaigen? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this spoiler-filled reading vlog, please leave a like and let me know in the comments below. I did do one for Assassin's Apprentice, and I am planning on doing one for Royal Assassin next. Because apparently traumatic is part of the brand now. If it traumatizes, I'm there for it. I'm only going to read it if it turns me into a shell of a human being and I feel awful about everyone and everything once I put it down. Because that's definitely a healthy response to reading. Thank you very much for watching. And a huge thank you to my patrons who keep this channel alive. Over there is bonus videos, writing snippets of whatever I'm working on, and you also get to pick what books and then vote on what we read for the monthly book club. So thank you again, your support is huge. Outro.